Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
Important. The village of Blackthorn Hollow had always prided itself upon its quiet respectability. Nestled between rolling green hills and narrow winding lanes lined with hawthorn hedges, it possessed the sort of peaceful charm that encouraged people to believe unpleasant things happened elsewhere. The church bells rang every Sunday with dependable regularity, the tea shop served the same currant buns it had served for 20 years, and gossip travelled far more quickly than automobiles ever could. At the centre of the village stood Blackthorn Hall. The estate had belonged to the Ashcombe family for generations, though in recent years its grandeur had begun to fade gently around the edges. Ivy crept across the old stone walls, several upper windows remained permanently shuttered, and the gardens, though still beautiful, carried the slight neglect of a household burdened by too many memories and too little money. Even so, the hall remained the social heart of Blackthorn Hollow. And in the evening everything changed. Nearly the entire village had gathered there for the annual autumn charity gala. Lanterns glowed warmly along the garden paths while servants moved between guests carrying silver trays of wine and delicate pastries. Music drifted softly from the drawing room where a local quartet performed near the grand staircase. The atmosphere was cheerful, refined, and comfortably predictable. Miss Marple sat quietly near the terrace doors beside Mrs. Bantry, observing the guests with mild interest while stirring sugar into her tea. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry whispered, lowering her voice discreetly, "something is quite wrong in this house tonight." Miss Marple glanced gently toward her. "Indeed, Mrs. Important." Bantry nodded faintly toward the far end of the drawing room where Eleanor Ashcombe stood speaking with her younger brother Adrian. "There," she murmured. "They've been quarrelling all evening." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved calmly across the room. Eleanor Ashcombe carried herself with the composed elegance expected of Blackthorn Hall's mistress, though strain lingered beneath her expression. Adrian, by contrast, appeared restless and impatient, his smile too quick and his movements too sharp. Whatever passed between them clearly lacked affection. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Families often preserve resentments more carefully than silverware." Nearby, Dr. Lionel Mercer laughed politely at something said by Reverend Phelps, though his attention seemed divided. Several times his gaze drifted toward Eleanor Ashcombe with visible concern. Across the room, Clara Whitmore stood alone near the staircase, one gloved hand resting lightly upon the banister. As the village schoolteacher, she was well liked though somewhat reserved. Tonight she appeared especially uneasy. Mrs. Bantry noticed it immediately. "That poor girl looks terrified." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "She expects something unpleasant. You know that already, my dear?" Miss Marple replied gently. "People expecting happiness move toward rooms. People expecting trouble watch the doors." At that moment a burst of laughter rose from the terrace outside where several younger guests gathered beneath strings of lantern light. Yet even among the cheerful voices, tension lingered faintly beneath the evening's surface. Blackthorn Hall itself seemed aware of it. The old house creaked softly around its guests as though listening. Important. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Eleanor Ashcombe stepped forward near the staircase and raised her glass politely. "If I may have everyone's attention," she said smoothly, "before dessert is served, I would like to thank you all for supporting St. Agnes Hospital once again this year." Applause followed warmly. Eleanor smiled gracefully, though her eyes briefly flickered toward Adrian. "Blackthorn Hollow has always relied upon the community," she continued. "And in difficult times, community matters more than ever." Miss Marple noticed Adrian's expression tighten instantly. Interesting, she thought. Very interesting indeed. As the applause faded, a servant approached Eleanor quietly and handed her a folded note. For the briefest moment, Eleanor's composure altered. Not dramatically, just enough. She read the note once, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her evening bag without comment. But Miss Marple saw the change immediately. A slight stiffness in the shoulders, a pause before speaking again, the sort of reaction produced not by surprise but by confirmation. "Dessert will be served in the conservatory," Eleanor announced calmly. Please enjoy the remainder of the evening." Music resumed softly as guests began moving toward the adjoining rooms. Conversation rose once more, though now accompanied by an undercurrent of unease difficult to define. Clara Whitmore crossed the drawing room quickly, intercepting Eleanor near the staircase. "You received it?" Clara whispered urgently. Eleanor's face remained composed. "Not now." "But he said tonight later, Clara." Miss Marple lowered her eyes toward her teacup politely, pretending not to hear, yet she noticed Clara's trembling hands and Eleanor's sudden coldness. Important. Moments later, Adrian Ashcombe disappeared down the western corridor leading toward the study wing. Dr. Mercer watched him go with visible irritation before following several minutes later. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer immediately. "There's drama brewing everywhere." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "And people become remarkably careless when they believe old secrets are about to surface." Outside, wind rustled faintly through the blackthorn hedges surrounding the estate. Then suddenly a gunshot shattered the night. The music stopped instantly. Several guests screamed. For one suspended moment, nobody moved at all. Then chaos erupted through Blackthorn Hall. Servants rushed into the corridors. Guests stumbled toward the western wing in confusion while frightened voices echoed beneath the high ceilings. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. Already she noticed something peculiar. Not everyone looked shocked. Some looked frightened. But one person, Eleanor Ashcombe, it looked as though she had been expecting the sound all evening. Important. The western corridor filled almost immediately with frightened voices and hurried footsteps. Guests crowded near the closed study door, while servants attempted unsuccessfully to restore calm. Somewhere deeper within the hall, a woman began crying softly. Eleanor Ashcombe reached the study first. Her hand trembled only once before she turned the brass handle and pushed the door inward. Several people gasped immediately. Adrian Ashcombe lay beside the writing desk, one arm stretched awkwardly across the carpet. A revolver rested several feet away near the fireplace, and the sharp scent of gunpowder still lingered faintly in the room. Dr. Lionel Mercer moved forward at once, kneeling beside the body while the others remained frozen near the doorway. After only a few seconds, the doctor looked up grimly. "He's dead." The announcement settled heavily across the corridor. Clara Whitmore pressed one hand against her mouth while Reverend Phelps murmured a quiet prayer beneath his breath. Mrs. Bantry looked horrified. "Oh dear," she whispered. "How dreadful." Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the others, her eyes moving calmly across the room itself rather than the body. The study appeared strangely orderly. Too orderly, perhaps. The desk chair remained neatly positioned. Papers lay stacked carefully beside the lamp. Even the overturned whiskey glass near Adrian's hand looked oddly deliberate. Eleanor Ashcombe stepped slowly into the room. "Was anyone with him?" she asked quietly. No one answered immediately. Dr. Mercer rose from beside the body. "I heard raised voices earlier," he said carefully, "but I saw no one enter afterward." Inspector Hale from Market Winslow was summoned immediately, though everyone knew it would take time before he arrived. Important. Until then, no one was permitted to leave Blackthorn Hall. The guests gathered uneasily in the drawing room where servants distributed untouched cups of tea to trembling hands. Conversation remained low and uncertain. Naturally, speculation began almost at once. "It must have been suicide," murmured one elderly guest quietly. The revolver was beside him. "No," whispered another. "I heard arguing before the shot." Mrs. Bantry sat beside Miss Marple near the fire. "My dear," she whispered anxiously. "What do you think?" Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "I think," she replied softly, "that people are already trying rather hard to simplify matters." Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly. "You don't believe it was suicide?" Miss Marple glanced toward the western corridor. "Possibly. But when deaths occur suddenly, human beings often rush toward the explanation they find emotionally convenient." At that moment, Clara Whitmore entered the drawing room looking pale and shaken. She moved toward the fireplace almost absently, as though desperate for warmth. Eleanor Ashcombe followed moments later. Unlike the others, she remained remarkably composed, too composed perhaps. Inspector Hale finally arrived shortly before 10:30. He was a broad-shouldered man with practical eyes and a deliberate manner suggesting little patience for village melodrama. After briefly examining the study, he returned to question the guests individually. "You discovered the body, Mrs. Ashcombe?" he asked. "Yes. And the revolver belonged to your brother?" "I believe so." Inspector Hale made a brief note. "Was Adrian distressed recently?" Eleanor hesitated faintly. "My brother was frequently distressed. Financial difficulties?" "Yes." "And personal disputes?" Another pause. "Yes." "Important." The inspector studied her carefully. "Did he quarrel with anyone tonight?" Eleanor's eyes lowered briefly. "With several people." Miss Marple observed quietly from across the room. Not grief, she thought. Control. Inspector Hale next questioned Dr. Mercer. "You heard raised voices?" "Yes." "Could you identify them?" "One was certainly Adrian." "And the other?" The doctor hesitated slightly. "I'm not entirely sure." Inspector Hale noticed it immediately. "But you suspect someone?" Dr. Mercer glanced briefly toward Eleanor Ashcombe before answering. "Yes." A subtle silence followed. Meanwhile, Miss Marple wandered quietly back toward the study while the questioning continued. The room remained undisturbed since the body's removal. She stood near the desk thoughtfully. Something troubled her considerably. Not the revolver, not the broken whiskey glass, but the lamp. It had been adjusted very low, casting only a narrow pool of light across the desk surface. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How curious," she murmured softly. "Most people involved in emotional confrontations increased light instinctively. Only people wishing to conceal expressions preferred shadows." Her gaze drifted toward the carpet near the fireplace. There, almost hidden beneath the edge of a chair, rested a tiny scrap of black fabric. Silk, perhaps. Miss Marple bent carefully and picked it up. A torn glove fingertip. Interesting indeed. At that moment, Inspector Hale entered behind her. "Notice something, Miss Marple." She held up the fabric gently. "Oh, merely a small untidiness." The inspector examined it briefly. "A lady's glove." "Yes." Inspector Hale frowned thoughtfully. "One of the women was in here before the shooting. Possibly afterward," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Important." The inspector looked around the carefully arranged room once more. Then suddenly his eyes narrowed. "Wait." He stepped toward the desk quickly. The whiskey glass. Miss Marple remained silent. Inspector Hale crouched near it carefully. "There's no spilled liquid on the carpet." A heavy pause settled between them. The overturned glass had been placed there after falling empty. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "Yes," she murmured quietly. "Someone seems to have been arranging a scene tonight." And somewhere beyond the study walls, Blackthorn Hall creaked softly in the dark like an old house guarding secrets it had protected for far too long. Important. Inspector Hale began formal questioning shortly before midnight, determined to establish the exact movements of every guest before memory and rumor distorted the evening beyond repair. The atmosphere inside Blackthorn Hall had grown increasingly strained. Guests who earlier had laughed over wine and music now spoke only in hushed tones, glancing nervously toward the western corridor whenever footsteps sounded nearby. Eleanor Ashcombe remained composed throughout. That composure troubled Miss Marple more with every passing hour. People reacted differently to grief, certainly. Some became loud, others silent. Yet Eleanor displayed neither confusion nor sorrow. Instead, she behaved like someone managing an unfortunate complication. Inspector Hale questioned Clara Whitmore first. The schoolteacher sat rigidly in the small morning room, twisting a handkerchief nervously between her fingers. "You spoke with Mrs. Ashcombe shortly before the shooting," the inspector said calmly. "Yes?" "What about?" Clara hesitated visibly. "Nothing important." Inspector Hale's expression remained patient. "Miss Whitmore, a man has died tonight." Clara swallowed hard. "It concerned Adrian." "Go on." "He had been threatening Eleanor for weeks." The inspector looked up sharply. "Threatening her how?" "I don't know precisely." Clara lowered her eyes. "But he constantly demanded money." Inspector Hale made a brief note. "And tonight?" "He sent Eleanor a message asking to meet privately." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused softly from the corner of the room. Interesting, very interesting indeed. Inspector Hale leaned forward slightly. Did Eleanor go to meet him? Yes. When? Just before the gunshot. A silence settled across the room. Important. Inspector Hale's attention sharpened immediately. You are certain? Yes. And how long afterward did the shot occur? Perhaps 3 minutes. The inspector exchanged a thoughtful glance with Miss Marple. 3 minutes was not long. Not nearly long enough for prolonged argument, suicide, and accidental discovery. Meanwhile, Dr. Lionel Mercer waited uneasily in the drawing room. When his turn came, Inspector Hale observed immediately that the doctor appeared deeply conflicted. You followed Adrian toward the study corridor earlier. Yes? Why... Dr. Mercer hesitated. Because I feared another quarrel. Between Adrian and Eleanor? Yes. Inspector Hale folded his arms. And did you overhear them? The doctor looked away briefly. I heard Adrian shouting. What did he say? A faint pause followed. He accused Eleanor of hiding something connected to their father's will. Inspector Hale's expression darkened thoughtfully. And Eleanor? She told him to lower his voice. Miss Marple observed him quietly. Not the whole truth, she thought. People withholding information often became unusually careful with small details while avoiding large ones entirely. Inspector Hale continued calmly. Did you enter the study? No. Then where were you when the shot was fired? In the gallery hall outside. Alone? Yes. Again Miss Marple noticed the hesitation. Tiny, but present. Later, while servants refreshed lamps throughout the hall, Miss Marple wandered quietly upstairs with Mrs. Bantry. My dear, Mrs. Bantry whispered anxiously, everyone seems to be hiding something. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. But hidden things are not always equally dangerous. They paused near the upper landing overlooking the entrance hall below. Important. From there, Miss Marple could see Eleanor Ashcombe standing alone near the staircase window, staring into the dark gardens outside. Not grieving. Calculating. Miss Marple descended slowly and approached her gently. My dear Mrs. Ashcombe, this has been a terrible shock. Eleanor gave a faint, controlled smile. Yes. You and your brother were close once, perhaps? For the first time, genuine emotion flickered briefly across Eleanor's face. Long ago. Miss Marple nodded softly. Families can become very tangled over time. Yes, Eleanor replied quietly. Especially when people refuse to let the past remain buried. Miss Marple watched her carefully. There it is, she thought, fear, not of scandal itself but of exposure. At that moment Inspector Hale entered carrying a folded sheet of paper recovered from Adrian's study desk. We've found something interesting, he announced. The room fell silent immediately. It appears Adrian intended to contest portions of the Blackthorn estate agreement. Eleanor's expression remained still. Inspector Hale continued. Specifically, he believed certain amendments made after their father's death were fraudulent. A murmur spread softly through the room. Dr. Mercer looked sharply toward Eleanor. Clara Whitmore turned pale instantly. Miss Marple noticed both reactions. Very curious indeed. Inspector Hale unfolded the document carefully. There's more. He glanced toward Eleanor directly. Adrian also noted that someone at Blackthorn Hall had been withdrawing money from the estate accounts for years. Silence settled heavily over the drawing room. Mrs. Bantry whispered softly, Good heavens! Inspector Hale's voice remained calm. Mrs. Ashcombe, were you aware of these accusations? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Yes. Important. And were they true? For several seconds nobody moved at all. Then Eleanor answered quietly. Partly. The inspector's eyes narrowed immediately. You admit altering estate finances? I adjusted funds to preserve Blackthorn Hall after my father's death. Her voice remained remarkably calm. Without intervention, the estate would have collapsed years ago. Inspector Hale studied her carefully, and Adrian threatened exposure. Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands softly. Interesting. A clear motive now existed, perhaps too clear. because people guilty of murder rarely admitted financial deception so calmly unless they believed something even worse remained hidden safely elsewhere. And somewhere within Blackthorn Hall, Miss Marple increasingly suspected another secret waited quietly beneath the first. Important. By the following morning, Blackthorn Hall had become a house divided quietly against itself. Guests gathered in uneasy clusters over breakfast, whispering theories whenever servants passed beyond earshot. The revelation concerning the estate finances had transformed Adrian Ashcombe's death from a shocking tragedy into something darker and far more personal. Money, Miss Marple reflected softly, rarely remained only about money. It usually concealed fear, humiliation, or resentment beneath its surface. Rain drifted steadily against the tall dining room windows while Eleanor Ashcombe sat at the far end of the table, untouched tea cooling beside her plate. Despite the strain surrounding her, she maintained the same composed dignity she had shown since the gunshot. Inspector Hale entered shortly after 9 carrying several documents recovered overnight from Adrian's study desk. "I should like everyone to remain available today," he announced calmly. "There are still serious inconsistencies concerning last night's timeline." A nervous silence followed. Clara Whitmore lowered her gaze immediately while Dr. Mercer appeared increasingly tense. Miss Marple noticed both reactions. Very interesting indeed. After breakfast, Inspector Hale questioned Eleanor privately in the library. The room smelled faintly of old leather bindings and extinguished firewood, its heavy curtains muting the grey daylight outside. "You admit altering estate accounts," the inspector said. "Yes." "For how long?" "Nearly 6 years." Inspector Hale studied her carefully. "And your brother discovered this recently?" "He suspected it for some time. But last night he threatened exposure." "Important." The inspector folded his arms. "Did you meet Adrian in the study after receiving his note?" "Important." Eleanor hesitated briefly. "Yes." "At what time?" "Shortly after 9. "And what occurred?" "He was angry. He accused me of theft." Her expression tightened faintly. "He also threatened to sell portions of the estate once legal control passed to him." Inspector Hale watched her steadily. "Then what?" "I left." "How long before the gunshot?" "Perhaps 5 minutes." The inspector frowned slightly. "Witnesses suggest less." Eleanor's eyes drifted toward the rain-streaked window. "I may have lost track of time." Miss Marple, seated quietly nearby with her knitting, noticed something else entirely. Eleanor never once asked who else had entered the study afterward, almost as though she already knew. Later that afternoon, Dr. Mercer requested to speak privately with Inspector Hale. They met in the smoking room where dark oak paneling and low firelight gave the conversation an atmosphere of uncomfortable intimacy. "There's something I failed to mention," the doctor admitted quietly. Inspector Hale's expression sharpened. "Go on." "I entered the study shortly before the shooting." A silence followed immediately. And? Adrian was alone. Dr. Mercer swallowed faintly, but he was badly agitated. Why? Had been drinking heavily. He claimed Eleanor had hidden something far worse than financial irregularities. Inspector Hale leaned forward slightly. "What exactly?" The doctor hesitated. He believed their father's death years ago was not natural. The room fell utterly silent. Inspector Hale stared at him. "That's an extraordinary accusation." "Yes, and you're only mentioning it now?" Dr. Mercer looked exhausted suddenly. "Because it sounds insane." Miss Marple, listening quietly near the doorway, folded her hands softly. "No," she thought. "Important, not insane. Merely dangerous." Inspector Hale spoke carefully. "What reason did Adrian give for believing this?" "He discovered inconsistencies in old medical records." Dr. Mercer lowered his voice. "Their father suffered heart failure officially, but Adrian believed certain medications had been deliberately altered." A long silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the fire. "Ah, now the true fear begins emerging, because financial scandals alone rarely produced such tension, but buried death certainly could." Inspector Hale resumed quietly. "And Eleanor knew Adrian suspected this?" "Yes." "Did he threaten to expose her publicly?" Yes, the inspector looked grim. So now we have a motive extending beyond inheritance. At that moment a servant entered carrying a small velvet case discovered earlier beneath a cabinet in the study. Inspector Hale opened it immediately. Inside rested a lady's black silk glove missing one fingertip, the same missing fingertip Miss Marple had discovered beside the fireplace. Inspector Hale looked up sharply. Mrs. Ashcombe. Eleanor stared at the glove without answering. Clara Whitmore, standing near the doorway, suddenly turned pale. Miss Marple noticed it instantly. Not surprising. Recognition. Inspector Hale rose slowly. "This belongs to one of you." No one spoke. Then quietly, almost unwillingly, Clara Whitmore said, "It's mine." A stunned silence followed. Inspector Hale's attention sharpened immediately. "You were in the study after all." Clara's hands trembled visibly now. "Yes." "When?" "Just before the shooting." "Why?" She looked toward Eleanor briefly before lowering her eyes. "Because Adrian sent it to me too." Inspector Hale stared. "Important. What possible reason would Adrian have to summon both you and Mrs. Ashcombe?" Clara hesitated painfully. Then at last, "Because I knew the truth about Mr. Ashcombe's death years ago." The room seemed to tighten around the confession itself. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Inspector Hale stepped forward carefully. "You helped conceal it?" "No!" Clara's voice cracked instantly. "I only discovered it afterward." Miss Marple watched her quietly. Real fear now. Not staged, not controlled. And suddenly, for the first time since the murder, Miss Marple became certain of one thing. Adrian Ashcombe had not died because of money. He had died because he came too close to a much older secret buried deep within Blackthorn Hall. Important. Clara Whitmore's confession transformed the atmosphere inside Blackthorn Hall almost immediately. What had begun as suspicion surrounding inheritance and financial deceit now carried the darker shadow of a death buried years in the past. Guests who earlier whispered about scandal now avoided speaking altogether, as though the hall itself had become dangerous. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the gardens wrapped in pale autumn mist. Inspector Hale questioned Clara Whitmore privately in the library while Miss Marple sat quietly nearby, her knitting untouched for once. Clara looked exhausted, the strain of concealment visibly eroding her composure. "You claim Adrian believed his father's death was suspicious," Inspector Hale said calmly. "Yes." "How did you become involved?" Clara hesitated faintly before answering. 5 years ago, shortly after Mr. Ashcombe died, I helped organize papers from his study. I discovered correspondence between him and Dr. Mercer." Inspector Hale looked up sharply. "Medical correspondence?" "Yes." And? Clara swallowed nervously. "There were references to altered medication doses. At the time I assumed it was harmless." Her voice lowered. "But Adrian later found the same letters." Inspector Hale's attention sharpened immediately, and concluded his father had been poisoned. "Yes," Miss Marple observed Clara carefully. Not deceit now, she thought. Only fear. Fear carried too long. Inspector Hale continued, "Why did Adrian summon you to the study last night?" "He wanted confirmation." Clara looked miserable. "He intended to confront Eleanor publicly before everyone. And did you confirm his suspicions?" "No." The answer came instantly. "Because I didn't truly know." Inspector Hale folded his arms thoughtfully. "Important. But you feared he might be right." Clara lowered her eyes. "Yes." At that moment Dr. Lionel Mercer entered the library unexpectedly. His expression darkened immediately upon seeing Clara. "You should not be speaking about matters you barely understand," he said sharply. Inspector Hale turned toward him. "Perhaps you can clarify them then." A tense silence followed. Dr. Mercer removed his spectacles slowly. "Arthur Ashcombe suffered from a severe heart condition," he said quietly. "His medications were adjusted several times during his final months." Inspector Hale watched him steadily. "Adjusted correctly?" The doctor hesitated. "Yes." Miss Marple noticed the hesitation instantly, tiny, but deeply revealing. Inspector Hale continued calmly. "Did Adrian accuse you personally?" "Yes." And was there reason for that accusation? Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened faintly. Adrian enjoyed dramatics. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward him thoughtfully. No, she reflected softly. Not dramatics, desperation. Later that afternoon, Inspector Hale examined the old medical letters recovered from Adrian's desk. Several pages referenced dosage changes authorized shortly before Arthur Ashcombe's death. One signature appeared repeatedly. Eleanor Ashcombe. The inspector frowned deeply. She approved the medication adjustments herself. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes. Households often become very intimate with illness. But if Arthur Ashcombe died because of incorrect medication, Miss Marple interrupted softly. One must still distinguish carefully between negligence, mercy, and murder. A silence followed. Inspector Hale leaned back wearily. This family seems buried beneath secrets. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Important, and secrets preserved for many years often begin controlling people rather than protecting them. At that moment the housekeeper entered carrying a small locked dispatch box discovered earlier in the attic storage room. We found this among Mr. Ashcombe's old belongings, she explained nervously. Inspector Hale unlocked it carefully. Inside rested financial ledgers, personal correspondence, and a leather-bound journal belonging to Arthur Ashcombe himself. The inspector opened it slowly. Several pages contained references to worsening illness and disputes with Adrian concerning the future of Blackthorn Hall. Then one particular entry caught his attention. Eleanor worries constantly now. She believes the estate cannot survive another year without drastic measures. Lionel insists my condition grows worse, though strangely I feel strongest when away from the hall. Inspector Hale read the line twice. Miss Marple's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. How curious, she murmured softly. The inspector looked toward her. Meaning? Invalids generally feel weakest away from familiar surroundings. Her eyes rested thoughtfully upon the journal. Unless the surroundings themselves contribute to the illness. A heavy silence settled across the library. Inspector Hale spoke quietly. You think Arthur suspected something, perhaps unconsciously. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. Human beings often recognize danger emotionally long before they admit it intellectually. The inspector turned another page. Near the end of the journal, Arthur's handwriting had become visibly unsteady. If anything happens unexpectedly, Eleanor must protect the hall at all costs. Adrian is reckless and would ruin everything. Inspector Hale frowned deeply. Important. That sounds almost like permission. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. Families can become tragically devoted to preservation. At that moment footsteps sounded hurriedly in the corridor outside. A servant appeared pale and breathless. Inspector, there's been another incident. Everyone looked up sharply. What happened? Inspector Hale demanded. The servant swallowed hard. Dr. Mercer's medical bag was found in the garden well. A stunned silence followed. Dr. Mercer stared visibly in shock. The well? Yes, sir. Inspector Hale's expression darkened immediately. Someone had attempted to dispose of evidence, or create new suspicion. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and moved toward the window overlooking the mist-covered gardens. Very dangerous now, she thought quietly. Because once old secrets began collapsing, frightened people often stopped thinking clearly. And frightened people, in her experience, were capable of almost anything. Important. The discovery of Dr. Mercer's medical bag in the old garden well unsettled Blackthorn Hall more deeply than the murder itself had done. By evening, even the servants moved through the corridors with visible nervousness, whispering anxiously whenever the doctor passed nearby. Inspector Hale ordered the bag retrieved immediately. It arrived damp and mud-streaked upon the library table shortly before dusk. Several medicine bottles inside had shattered from the fall, though one remained intact beneath the soaked leather lining. Miss Marple observed quietly as the inspector examined the label. Digitalis, Dr. Mercer said grimly. Used for heart conditions. Inspector Hale looked up sharply. The same medication Arthur Ashcombe received. Yes. A silence settled heavily across the room. Inspector Hale's expression darkened thoughtfully. Someone wanted this hidden. Dr. Mercer folded his arms tightly. Or someone wished it was discovered. Miss Marple's eyes lifted softly. An excellent distinction. The inspector frowned slightly. You believe the well was too obvious. My dear Inspector, Miss Marple replied gently, people truly disposing of dangerous evidence rarely select locations servants inspect every autumn during cleaning. Inspector Hale considered that carefully. A staged discovery, perhaps. Another arrangement. Blackthorn Hall seemed increasingly full of them. Meanwhile, Eleanor Ashcombe remained secluded in the upstairs sitting room overlooking the gardens. Clara Whitmore sat beside the cold fireplace, twisting her hands anxiously while Eleanor stared silently through the darkening windows. He suspects you now, Clara whispered. Eleanor's voice remained calm. He has suspected me from the beginning. But the journal, the medicine, important. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. I know. Clara hesitated painfully. Tell me honestly, Eleanor, did you alter your father's medication? A long silence followed. Then quietly, Yes. Clara stared at her in horror. Oh God, it was not murder, Eleanor said sharply. You don't understand what his suffering has become. Clara's face had gone pale, and Adrian discovered this. Yes. The silence that followed felt enormous. Miss Marple, passing slowly through the corridor outside, heard only fragments of the conversation, yet the tone alone revealed enough, confession, but not necessarily to murder. She paused thoughtfully near the staircase. People who committed one desperate act long ago often became vulnerable to manipulation afterward, especially my family, especially by those who enjoyed power. Later that evening, Inspector Hale questioned Dr. Mercer once again in the study. You knew Eleanor adjusted the medication, he said quietly. The doctor removed his spectacles wearily. Yes. And you allowed it. Arthur Ashcombe was dying slowly and painfully. Dr. Mercer's expression hardened faintly. Eleanor believed she was sparing him prolonged suffering. Inspector Hale watched him steadily. But legally? No, the doctor admitted softly. Legally it was indefensible. A silence followed. And Adrian discovered this recently. Yes, he threatened exposure. Yes. Inspector Hale leaned forward slightly. So Eleanor had a motive to silence him. Dr. Mercer met his gaze directly now. She had a motive to fear scandal. That is not the same thing. Miss Marple sat quietly near the lamp, her knitting resting idle in her lap. Quite true, she thought. People frequently confused desperation with violence. Inspector Hale continued calmly. Important. You also cared for Eleanor personally, didn't you? For the first time, Dr. Mercer hesitated visibly. Yes. And Adrian knew that as well. Another silence. Yes. Interesting indeed. Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the study desk. Emotional loyalties complicated everything. Perhaps intentionally. At that moment, the housekeeper entered nervously, carrying a folded handkerchief discovered earlier beneath the study sofa. Inspector Hale unfolded it carefully. Dark stains marked one corner. Blood. Dr. Mercer frowned immediately. That wasn't there earlier. Inspector Hale examined the embroidery along the edge. The initials C.W. Clara Whitmore. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Too convenient. Far too convenient. Inspector Hale rose immediately. Where is Miss Whitmore? They found Clara moments later near the chapel garden behind the hall. She looked startled and frightened as Inspector Hale approached, holding the handkerchief. This belongs to you. Clara stared at it in confusion. Yes, but I lost it days ago. Inspector Hale's voice hardened slightly. It was hidden beneath the study sofa beside the body. Clara's face drained of color instantly. I never put it there. Yet your torn glove was also found in the study. Tears filled her eyes suddenly. I only went there before the shooting. Adrian wanted me to confirm what Eleanor had done years ago. Her voice shook painfully. I left before anyone died. Inspector Hale studied her carefully. You expect me to believe someone planted this afterward? Yes. Miss Marple stepped gently beside them. My dear, she said softly. When did you first notice your glove torn? Clara blinked uncertainly. I don't remember exactly, but not last night. No. Important. Miss Marple nodded faintly. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. Because people planting evidence often overlooked one essential thing: timing. Inspector Hale looked toward Miss Marple expectantly. She folded her hands gently. The glove fingertip may indeed connect Miss Whitmore to the study. Her eyes rested quietly upon the handkerchief, but this was added later. The inspector frowned. How can you tell? Miss Marple smiled softly. Because frightened people hiding evidence usually conceal one thing at a time. She glanced toward the blood-stained fabric. Only storytellers arrange clues in pairs. A silence followed. And somewhere within Blackthorn Hall, someone had clearly begun telling a very deliberate story indeed. Important. By the third day after Adrian Ashcombe's death, Blackthorn Hall had become suffocating beneath the weight of suspicion. The guests remaining inside no longer trusted one another, and every whispered conversation seemed to end abruptly whenever footsteps approached. Even the servants carried themselves cautiously now, as though fearful of overhearing the wrong secret. Inspector Hale spent the morning reconstructing timelines once again. The difficulty remained maddeningly consistent. Too many people had entered or approached the study before the gunshot. Eleanor Ashcombe, Clara Whitmore, Dr. Mercer, possibly others unseen. And still no one could explain why the scene itself appeared increasingly artificial. Miss Marple sat quietly in the conservatory with Mrs. Bantry while pale sunlight filtered weakly through the glass ceiling overhead. "My dear," Mrs. Bantry whispered anxiously, "surely Eleanor must be responsible for something." "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "But responsibility and murder are not always identical." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "You still think someone is misleading the investigation?" Miss Marple nodded softly, repeatedly. Her eyes drifted toward the frost-touched gardens beyond the glass. What troubled her most now was not the planted evidence itself, it was the pattern behind it. Each discovery pushed suspicion toward a different person. First Eleanor, then Dr. Mercer, then Clara, almost as though someone intended confusion rather than accusation. At that moment Inspector Hale entered carrying Arthur Ashcombe's journal once more. "I've been reading the final entries again," he said. Miss Marple looked up politely. And? There's something peculiar." He opened the journal carefully. "Important. Arthur repeatedly mentions meeting someone in the chapel garden during his final weeks." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "The chapel garden?" Inspector Hale nodded. "He never names the person directly." Miss Marple's attention sharpened slightly. "Does he describe them?" "Only vaguely." The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "He refers to them several times as the only honest soul left in the house." A silence followed. "Interesting indeed." Inspector Hale continued quietly. "One final entry particularly caught my attention." He read aloud slowly. "If Eleanor discovers our conversations, matters may become impossible. Yet the truth cannot remain hidden forever." Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. "You see?" she whispered. "He feared Eleanor." Miss Marple remained thoughtful. "Perhaps," she murmured softly. "Or perhaps he feared what truth itself would do to the family." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple wandered alone toward the small chapel garden behind the hall. The stone paths remained damp from recent rain while dead autumn leaves gathered beneath weathered benches. The garden possessed an odd stillness, a place for confidence, and possibly betrayal. Near the far hedge she noticed Clara Whitmore standing alone beside the old sundial. The young woman looked pale and exhausted. "Miss Whitmore," Miss Marple said gently. Clara managed a faint smile. "I suppose everyone believes him guilty now." "My dear," Miss Marple replied softly, "villages always enjoy believing the wrong thing first. It makes later gossip much more satisfying." A weak laugh escaped Clara despite herself. Then her expression darkened again. "I should have spoken years ago." "About Arthur Ashcombe?" "Yes." Miss Marple waited quietly. Clara lowered her eyes. He knew he was being slowly poisoned. "Important." The words settled heavily between them. Miss Marple spoke very softly. "And he told you this personally?" "Yes." "Did he name the person responsible?" No. Clara swallowed hard. But he believed someone altered his medicine deliberately. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Did you believe him? At first, no. He was often confused during illness. Clara's voice trembled faintly. But later I became uncertain. A silence followed. Then Miss Marple asked gently, "Why did you never tell Adrian?" Clara looked startled. "Because Adrian frightened me." "Ah, there it is," thought Miss Marple quietly. "Not hatred, fear," Clara continued nervously. "He became obsessed after discovering the medical letters. He talked constantly about exposing Eleanor publicly." She shook her head faintly. "But sometimes it felt less like justice and more like revenge." Miss Marple nodded softly. "Yes, human beings often disguise cruelty as righteousness." At that moment footsteps approached across the stone path. Dr. Mercer emerged from the hedge entrance looking visibly tense. He stopped immediately upon seeing Clara. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said quietly. Clara stiffened. "I am perfectly capable of walking in a garden." The doctor glanced toward Miss Marple uneasily. "There are still matters unresolved." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured softly. Dr. Mercer hesitated before speaking again. "Inspector Hale searched Adrian's rooms this morning." Clara looked alarmed instantly. "And he found correspondence addressed to you." A silence followed. Clara's face was drained of color. Miss Marple watched carefully. Not guilt this time, panic. Dr. Mercer continued quietly. "Adrian claimed you possessed proof concerning Arthur's death." "That isn't true," Clara whispered. "Important, but he believed it." Clara suddenly looked near tears. "Because I lied to him." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. "You lied?" "Yes." Clara clasped her trembling hands together. "I told Adrian I had evidence only to stop him from confronting Eleanor publicly." Dr. Mercer stared at her. "You invented it?" "Yes." A heavy silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke very gently. "My dear, did anyone else know you told Adrian that?" Clara blinked uncertainly. "I am not sure." Miss Marple lowered her eyes thoughtfully, because suddenly at last she understood why Adrian Ashcombe had truly died. Not because someone feared what he knew, but because someone feared what they believed Clara Whitmore might reveal next. Important. That evening an uneasy fog settled across the grounds of Blackthorn Hall, swallowing the gardens and hedgerows in pale drifting silence. Inside, lamps burned low while tension moved invisibly through the corridors like another presence among the guests. Miss Marple sat beside the drawing-room fire with her knitting resting untouched once more in her lap. Her thoughts had become increasingly clear throughout the afternoon. Adrian Ashcombe had not died because of inheritance alone, nor solely because of Arthur Ashcombe's suspicious illness years earlier. He had died because someone believed Clara Whitmore possessed evidence capable of destroying them completely, and that meant fear not anger had driven the killer. Inspector Hale entered carrying a bundle of letters recovered from Adrian's bedroom earlier that day. "I've finished reviewing the correspondence," he said quietly. Mrs. Bantry looked up eagerly. "And?" The inspector frowned. Adrian became convinced Clara intended to expose the truth publicly. Miss Marple nodded softly. "Yes, but the interesting question is who else shared that belief." Inspector Hale sat heavily near the fire. "Whoever killed him must have thought Clara possessed proof." "Exactly." A silence settled over the room. Mrs. Bantry spoke hesitantly, but Clara admitted she lied. "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Unfortunately, frightened people often act before confirming facts." Inspector Hale leaned forward thoughtfully. "There's still something troubling me. If the murder was impulsive, why arrange the study afterward?" Miss Marple's eyes softened faintly. "Because the killer realized almost immediately that panic alone would not protect them." The inspector looked toward her sharply. "You think the staging began within minutes?" "Important." "Oh, yes." She folded her hands calmly. The overturned whiskey glass, the planted handkerchief, the confusion regarding timelines. All attempts to scatter suspicion rather than direct it. Inspector Hale frowned deeply. "Then why implicate multiple people?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. because the killer knew too much about everyone involved. A heavy silence followed. At that moment Eleanor Ashcombe entered quietly from the corridor. She appeared exhausted now, the careful composure she had maintained since Adrian's death beginning finally to fracture. "Inspector," she said softly, "there's something I should have told you earlier." Inspector Hale straightened immediately. "Go on." Eleanor hesitated painfully. "The night Adrian died, he wasn't the only person threatening exposure." Miss Marple lifted her eyes quietly. "Interesting indeed." Eleanor continued slowly. "Earlier that evening, Adrian confronted Dr. Mercer in the gallery hall. They argued violently." The inspector frowned. "About Arthur Ashcombe?" "Yes." Eleanor looked toward the fire. "Adrian accused Lionel of helping conceal deliberate poisoning." Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Inspector Hale spoke carefully. "And how did Dr. Mercer respond?" "He denied everything at first." Eleanor's voice lowered faintly. "But Adrian threatened to go to the police regardless." A long silence followed. Miss Marple watched Eleanor thoughtfully. Truth now. At least partly. Inspector Hale rose immediately. "Where is Dr. Mercer?" "In the conservatory," Eleanor replied quietly. They found the doctor standing alone beside the fog-covered glass windows, one hand resting heavily against the frame. He looked tired beyond measure. Inspector Hale wasted little time. "You argued with Adrian before his death." "Doctor, important." Mercer closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." "He accused you of helping poison Arthur Ashcombe." "Yes." And the doctor looked toward the dark gardens outside. "I told him he understood nothing about suffering." A silence followed. Inspector Hale's voice hardened slightly. "Did you assist Eleanor in altering Arthur's medication?" Dr. Mercer answered without hesitation this time. "Yes." Mrs. Bantry inhaled sharply behind them. The doctor continued quietly. "Arthur was dying slowly, painfully. Eleanor believed in the end that suffering was mercy." His face tightened faintly. "I agreed." Inspector Hale stared at him. "You're admitting assisted murder." "I'm admitting compassion." The doctor's voice roughened, perhaps wrongly. Miss Marple observed him carefully. No fear now. Only exhaustion. Inspector Hale stepped closer. "Did Adrian threaten to expose you publicly?" "Yes." "And did that confrontation continue inside the study?" "No." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Then where were you when the shot was fired?" Dr. Mercer hesitated briefly. "In the east corridor." "Can anyone confirm that?" "No." The conservatory fell silent except for faint wind against the glass roof overhead. Then Miss Marple spoke gently. "Dr. Mercer, when did you first learn Clara Whitmore claimed to possess evidence?" The doctor blinked slightly. "Earlier that afternoon." "From whom?" A pause. "Adrian himself." Miss Marple nodded softly. "And how did he seem while discussing it?" The doctor frowned faintly, remembering. Triumphant. "Ah, there it is," thought Miss Marple quietly. Inspector Hale looked toward her expectantly. But Miss Marple remained silent for several moments, because something else had finally settled into place within her mind. Important. Not merely who killed Adrian, but why did the killer arrange such elaborate confusion afterward? It was not simply self-protection. It was protection mixed with guilt. Guilt toward Eleanor, toward Arthur, toward the entire collapsing family itself. And suddenly, Miss Marple realized the most dangerous person in Blackthorn Hall was not the one hiding old Mercy, but the one who believed themselves morally justified in preserving it forever. Important. The fog surrounding Blackthorn Hall thickened overnight until the estate seemed entirely cut off from the outside world. By morning, even the nearest hedgerows had vanished beneath pale grey mist, leaving the hall isolated and strangely unreal. Inside, the tension had become unbearable. Nobody trusted anyone completely now. Not Eleanor Ashcombe, not Clara Whitmore, not even Dr. Mercer. Inspector Hale spent most of the morning reviewing statements for inconsistencies while Miss Marple sat quietly nearby, observing not the words themselves but the strain beneath them. Because strain, she often reflected, revealed far more than lies. Dr. Mercer appeared particularly worn now. The confession concerning Arthur Ashcombe's medication had clearly exhausted him, though strangely it seemed to relieve him as well. Years of concealed guilt had finally begun surfacing. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced he had murdered Adrian. Something essential still failed to fit. Near midday, Mrs. Bantry joined Miss Marple in the small morning room overlooking the eastern lawns. "My dear," she whispered anxiously, "surely the doctor must be responsible now." Miss Marple shook her head softly. "No, but he admitted helping Eleanor, yes. And because he has already crossed one moral boundary, everyone assumes him capable of crossing another." She folded her hands gently. "Human beings do love tidy patterns." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the fogged windows. "Someone who believed they were protecting Eleanor rather than themselves." A silence followed. Then suddenly Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Colonel Fenwick." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You see how quickly assumptions arrive once one begins observing character instead of evidence." Important. Colonel Matthew Fenwick had remained largely unnoticed throughout the investigation. A long-time friend of the Ashcombe family, he had attended the gala quietly and spent much of the following days offering practical support to Eleanor. Too quietly, perhaps. Miss Marple now recalled several small details about him with increasing clarity. His immediate insistence that Adrian's death resembled suicide, his repeated efforts to calm Eleanor before questioning, and most importantly his absence during several crucial moments no one had carefully accounted for. Interesting indeed. Inspector Hale entered moments later carrying a recovered revolver report. "The shot was fired from remarkably close range," he announced. Miss Marple looked up softly. "Not surprising." The inspector frowned. "You expected that?" "My dear Inspector, genuine arguments rarely conclude from across rooms." He considered that carefully. "Then Adrian probably knew his killer." "Oh, yes." Inspector Hale sat heavily across from her. "There's something else. One servant now recalls seeing Colonel Fenwick near the study corridor shortly before the gunshot." Mrs. Bantry inhaled sharply. "There!" But Miss Marple remained thoughtful. "Not enough yet. Never rush." Inspector Hale continued. "The Colonel claims he merely went searching for brandy." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured gently. "People searching for alcohol after dinner rarely select dark study corridors instead of dining rooms." The inspector almost smiled. "Exactly my thought." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple requested tea be served in the library for several remaining guests, including Colonel Fenwick himself. Important. The elderly colonel arrived calm and courteous as always, though Miss Marple noticed faint tension around his eyes immediately upon entering. Fear concealed beneath discipline. A military habit, perhaps. Conversation drifted politely at first toward village matters and estate finances. Then gradually, almost invisibly, Miss Marple guided it elsewhere. "Such sadness for Mrs. Ashcombe," she said softly. "To endure both her father's illness years ago and now poor Adrian." Colonel Fenwick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he replied quietly. "She has suffered greatly." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And naturally one understands why people wish to protect her." The colonel looked toward her sharply now. Only briefly. "But enough." Miss Marple continued stirring her tea calmly. "Especially from Adrian's cruelty. He seems to have enjoyed frightening people." No one spoke. Then Colonel Fenwick said quietly, "Adrian lacked compassion." "Ah, there it is. Not anger. Judgment." Miss Marple lifted her eyes gently toward him. "And yet compassion can become dangerous too. Can it not?" For the first time since entering the room, Colonel Fenwick appeared genuinely unsettled. Inspector Hale, standing silently near the mantelpiece, watched carefully. Miss Marple continued softly. "When people convince themselves they are protecting others, they sometimes excuse terrible actions." The colonel rose abruptly. "I fail to see your meaning." "Oh, I think you see it perfectly." Miss Marple's voice remained kind. "You cared deeply for Eleanor Ashcombe, perhaps for many years." A heavy silence settled over the library. Colonel Fenwick stared at her without speaking. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. Important. You learned Adrian intended to expose not only the estate scandal but Arthur Ashcombe's death as well. And you believed such exposure would destroy Eleanor completely. The Colonel's face had gone pale now. Inspector Hale stepped forward quietly. You were near the study that night. Still silent, Miss Marple spoke one final time. You did not plan murder, Colonel, but Adrian provoked you. And when he threatened Eleanor again, her eyes softened sadly. You convinced yourself removing him was an act of protection. For several long seconds, Colonel Fenwick remained utterly motionless. Then slowly, with exhausted defeat, he lowered his head. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood the truth before a single confession had even begun. Important. The library at Blackthorn Hall felt unnaturally still after Colonel Fenwick lowered his head in silence. Outside, the fog pressed heavily against the tall windows, muting the world beyond the estate until the room itself seemed sealed away from ordinary life. Inspector Hale stood motionless near the mantelpiece. Mrs. Bantry stared at the Colonel in open shock while Eleanor Ashcombe remained seated beside the fire, her face pale with disbelief. Only Miss Marple appeared calm. Not triumphant, never that. Merely saddened by another example of human weakness disguised as devotion. At last Inspector Hale spoke quietly. Colonel Fenwick, do you wish to explain yourself? The Colonel remained silent for several moments before answering. Yes. His voice sounded tired now, stripped of the firm confidence he had maintained throughout the investigation. I went to study shortly after 9. He stared toward the fire rather than at anyone present. Adrian had already been drinking heavily. He was furious about the estate accounts and even more obsessed with Arthur's death. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The Colonel continued. He intended to expose everything publicly that very night. His jaw tightened faintly. Not because he cared about justice, because he wanted Eleanor ruined. Inspector Hale folded his arms. And you confronted him? Yes. What happened? The Colonel gave a faint, bitter sigh. He mocked Eleanor viciously. Said the hall would collapse once scandal reached the village. His hands tightened behind his back. Then he began speaking about prison. A silence settled across the room. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Not hatred, still protection, still justification. The Colonel's voice lowered. I told him he was cruel. He laughed at me. Important. His eyes closed briefly. Then he reached for the revolver on the desk. Inspector Hale frowned sharply. The revolver belonged to Adrian? Yes. And? We struggled. The Colonel swallowed heavily. The gun discharged. Mrs. Bantry gasped softly. Eleanor looked horrified now. The Colonel continued quietly. At first I thought he was merely wounded, but when he fell, he stopped speaking for a moment. I realized he was dead. Inspector Hale studied him carefully. Then you arranged the scene afterward? Yes. Why? The Colonel looked toward Eleanor at last. To protect her. A painful silence followed. Eleanor whispered faintly, Matthew. He shook his head softly. You had already suffered enough. Miss Marple lowered her eyes gently. How often people destroy themselves attempting to spare others pain. Inspector Hale resumed calmly. You planted evidence against Clara Whitmore. Yes. And against Dr. Mercer. The Colonel nodded once. I knew suspicion already surrounded them both. It seemed, he hesitated bitterly. Plausible, Miss Marple spoke softly. But you overcomplicated matters. The Colonel looked toward her. You noticed, my dear Colonel, she replied gently. People acting from panic generally hide things. They do not compose elaborate narratives. A faint sadness touched her expression. Only intelligent people make murders untidy by attempting to improve them afterward. A silence followed. Inspector Hale stepped forward quietly. You also stopped the clock, yes. Why exactly 9:23? The Colonel gave a tired smile devoid of humor, because it was the first time I looked at the clock after the shooting. He glanced toward the fogged windows. Important. I thought if the timeline became uncertain, the investigation would scatter. Miss Marple nodded softly. Yes, but uncertainty itself often attracts attention. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair now, her composure visibly breaking for the first time since Adrian's death. "You should have told the truth," she whispered. The colonel looked at her sadly. "And destroy what little remained of your family." There was nothing left to save. Her voice trembled faintly with exhaustion and grief. Inspector Hale remained silent for a moment before speaking carefully. "Colonel Fenwick, I must ask you to come with me." The old soldier straightened instinctively, dignity returning faintly to his posture despite the defeat in his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. As Inspector Hale escorted him toward the library door, the tension that had haunted Blackthorn Hall for days seemed finally to loosen, though not entirely disappear. Because truth rarely restored peace completely. It merely replaced uncertainty with sorrow. After the door closed behind them, silence lingered heavily inside the room. Mrs. Bantry exhaled softly. "What a terrible waste." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes." Eleanor remained standing near the fire, staring into the flames. "I never imagined anyone would do such a thing for me." Miss Marple looked toward her quietly. "My dear, people are often far more dangerous when acting out of loyalty than hatred." She folded her hands softly in her lap. "Hatred exhausts itself quickly. Devotion can endure for years." Outside, the fog had finally begun to thin across the gardens of Blackthorn Hall. Faint outlines of the hedges and stone paths slowly reappeared beneath the pale afternoon light. Mrs. Bantry moved toward the window. "It almost looks peaceful again." "Important." Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. "Oh yes," she murmured softly. "Villages always become peaceful again eventually." Her eyes drifted thoughtfully toward the distant chapel garden. "That is how they manage to hide so many dreadful things beneath such charming surfaces."